So, Tom and Kate, nice to see you both. Welcome and fire away.
Okay, so my name is Kate Dawkins. I'm a surface water planning engineer, and with me is Tom Parsons. So we'll be providing you with an update on something we talked to you about back in February, which is development of the surface flooding reduction program. So if I can have the first slide, please. Thank you. So we'll be giving you a bit of a brief overview of the program and a recap of what we talked to you about previously. Since then, we've been working on developing the priority matrix, which is going to inform the program development. Then I'll be handing over to Tom to talk about the outcomes of that and the prioritisation issues that we've been through and the next steps to develop the program. Next slide, please. So this is the surface flooding reduction program that was established through your resolution in the long-term plan. It set out around $20 million of funding starting in financial year 27. So we're really working towards being able to get in a position to identify some projects and start being able to spend that capital money. A key part of the resolution was addressing sites against a priority matrix to be established, and that was something that you wanted to develop. So we've been thinking about what exactly that means and what that might look like. So if we can have the next slide, please. This is what we presented as an idea in February, as this is what the priority matrix could look like. On the left-hand side, we've got criteria to be ranked in terms of what would be a flooding issue. Being a low-lying and coastal city, we do have surface water when it rains, and that's to be expected in our waterways and roads, for example. We have to give some thought to when does that actually constitute an issue to the community, and so we suggested some issue types at the first workshop, and then you've been away and ranked those with a survey. So if you can have the next one, please. Thank you. That's what we presented in February, and then next one, please. We have been, since that time, crunching some numbers and scoring each of the areas in the city against those criteria, and what we'll present to you today is the ranking of those areas based on those criteria. So it'll be a relative comparison of hotspots around the city, so you can see where everything falls. We'll talk about then the next steps, and that's not necessarily the order in which you might be able to tackle those priority areas in terms of a feasible solution. So there's a bit more work to do to arrive at some projects. Next slide, please. So this is just a recap of where we've been. Like we said in workshop 1 in February, we talked about what types of issues you might like to consider using this funding for. We presented some suggestions, you then added some, and then the survey was sent out with a couple of weeks to respond to that, where you provided us some ranking of those issue types, and also were able to comment on some areas that you would like considered. So then since March, we've taken those responses in terms of the issues and the areas. We've been analysing that across the district, crunching some numbers, and we'll be presenting to you the outcomes of that in terms of the ranking of areas across the city, across the district, and then we've got some work to do to commence the program. Next slide, please. So this is the feedback that we received from the survey. So there were a number of different issue types that were presented, and through the survey you were able to firstly say, is this issue, do I consider this to be an issue? Some things were not considered something that you'd like to address through this program, and then of those issues they were given a ranking. And so number 1 up the top here, we've got our typical indicator that is a KPI for council, and something that there's been a lot of work on addressing in recent years through earthquake recovery and other initiatives through capital projects and regulatory responses. So we do have quite a focus on flooding of residential floor levels. So like I say, there's been a lot of work in that space. Still from the development of the city, that means that it's still an issue in some areas. All of these other issues are things that have been added into consideration, and so there was a request for photos to illustrate each of those, and I'll talk through each of those on the next slides. There were, it's important to note, I guess there were things that were not considered issues through the survey process. So for example, we've got on here flooding which might affect a building or affect access to said building. There's nothing that was brought through the survey which was purely relating to flooding on land. in and of itself. So any flooding on someone's garden or yard or paddock, for example, that wasn't considered significant enough an issue to warrant inclusion in this program. Next slide, please. So yeah, like I say, our first ranked issue is flooding, which is above or near to the floor level of a residential building, and as we know, that can create a number of issues for the building and the inhabitants in terms of dampness and effects on the furnishings and the function of that building. Second was flooding around the sites of our critical infrastructure assets, so that's our council assets, our pump stations, and also other infrastructure assets for the community, such as substations and data centres. So that has been given a high priority. Relative to the number of sites across the city, though, there are not as many of those which are affected. So whilst it's ranked highly, it's not particularly prevalent in our analysis. Next slide, please. So this one also came through, was flooding of the commercial buildings, so that's not something that's addressed elsewhere, and also flooding of critical buildings, such as emergency services buildings, hospitals, GPs, that type of thing. Next slide, please. So as well as flooding above a residential floor, we've also got the effects of flooding below that floor level, so flooding beneath the residential building. Number 6 was something that we know as a concern for some people around access to properties, and so this is something we had to give some consideration to as to how you would assess that, and there was feedback around it's not necessarily a temporary effect, but we're more interested in addressing prolonged effects where people are restricted from entry and exit to properties. So that's something that comes through quite a lot in this analysis, is picking up areas where that is restricted. Slide, please. So we've also looked at other types of buildings and grouped them into something called community buildings, which is around service centres or community facilities such as this. Also areas such as schools, early childcare, marae, nursing homes, where there's a community function or a function of younger or older residents that might be given particular significance. Number 8 was something that came through in the feedback, was a particular interest in areas where the issue has been long-standing. And so this is something that we've used really as a pass-fail criteria when we look at the areas to say, has this issue that's been identified been something that has been experienced previously? It's not something that's been a one-off, not something that's necessarily theoretical. Anything that's taken forward is something where we do have evidence that this has been a long-standing issue. Next slide, please. So as well as general access issues into properties, there was also a criteria of flooding on arterial roads specifically, just given the impact that that can have on the wider network and movement of traffic. Number 10 was something that came through in the feedback from the first workshop, and that was asking us to consider the financial loss, or to quantify the financial loss that might be incurred by a commercial business. Now this is something that we are unable to assess through this analysis. It's not something that we have the data on or necessarily can quantify the impact on a particular business in terms of flooding. But rest assured, the flooding of a commercial building is definitely considered in that earlier criteria, so we have reflected that. We just aren't able to quantify the dollar impact. Next slide, please. And so because we were unable to assess that earlier criteria, we elevated one of the lower ranked criteria and also considered deeper flooding on residential property. Next slide, please. So in order to assess where this might occur across the district, because we're doing this on a very large scale, we started with a consistent basis of comparison, which is our flood modelling. And so that is an assessment of various different types of storms, and it looks at the worst possible scenario for a particular event. So that can really differ from what we might experience in an individual rain event. So it might differ from what we saw at the start of May, for example, where different rain occurred in different parts of the district. But it provides that consistent platform when we're having a starting point across the whole district. We then went through a process which we'll talk about later of actually validating that. is what has been observed. Next slide, please. So we use our flood modelling to look at where the water might be in a particular event across the district, and then we've overlaid that with each of the things that we might be concerned about against those issue criteria. So our residential buildings, making assumptions around what the floor level of that might be, or using data we have on the floor level of that building to assess whether that water is above or below floor level, looking at where commercial buildings are, looking at where roads are, for example. So that all gets overlaid and was identified as everywhere where one of those criteria might occur in an event is plotted across the district. So as you can see, there's quite widespread potential for surface flooding, and so what we then need to do to identify particular areas to tackle is cluster those together and look at where there might be multiple instances of that occurring to warrant a council project intervention. Next slide, please. So this is the result of that clustering and looking at where we have a collection of surface flooding issues that are occurring. So we've gone and based on that analysis identified areas. Some of these new areas identified through the analysis that we've done. Many of them are areas that have been commented on previously or reported on previously, and also those that you've included in the survey responses. They have all been included in this list. And these areas which have been. There is a lot, yes. So we've come up with 158, and that's not necessarily every issue, but that's every clustering that we've done of issues. And so, as you say, there is a lot across the district, and so
it's probably just a good time to add that as part of our drainage system, we drain water from properties onto roads and into the pipes and then out to our waterways. So, as part of the modelling work, we represent that. And so inherently we pick up where there's water on roads. And as we have a criteria that's identified for access issues, we are inherently going to identify issues right across the district because that is the nature of the way stormwater is managed. So yes, the number 158 and the spread looks quite dramatic, but it is also just inherent with the way the system works. Sorry.
So next slide, please. And we've also included Banks Peninsula, of course, being a key part of the district. The difference is that for Banks Peninsula we don't have flood modelling, so the identification of the areas is really based off the reported issues, our operations team and community experiences of flooding.
Is the Teddington flat on there?
So we, for Banks Peninsula, we don't have district-wide flood model to take. So we have used anecdotal information from the stormwater management plans and from the lists provided through feedback from the survey. So that hasn't been identified in our through that process, although Teddington Flat was clearly identified through the coastal hazards planning process for increase in flood risk moving forward. So certainly a good one to think about moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
And that is, I guess, a good point to raise around the criteria of has it been a long-standing issue, and the way we've analysed this, it's based on present-day climate and previous issues have been experienced. So, of course, a number of these areas may be subject to increasing risk in future, but we're looking at identifying as a starting point existing issues. Next slide, please. So once we have all of those areas, we've then gone and punched some numbers and assessed those against each of the criteria that was identified. So we would look at an area and say, for example, there are this number of residential buildings which are predicted to have flooding above floor level. There are this number of buildings which are predicted to have access issues. Count all of those up against the criteria and give them a score. So as we talked about, that is something that's, because we did it on a large scale, based on the modelling and those numbers, we then wanted to moderate that based on community experience, based on our operations team experience, and really test the numbers that we were getting back from that analysis. So we've used a few different sources of information for that, the key one being, is it something that you've mentioned to us through the survey or through previous resolutions? Is it something that we've got good observations of through things like Snaps and Solve or other reports to council? Have we got road closures that have been recurring in these locations? And also some assessment of the modelling in that area. So some areas, for example, we will have monitoring instruments installed and we can really validate what the model is telling us. Other areas, it's more something that we're having to use our best judgment on. So that's something that once we took the numbers, we then moderated them. And so areas which do have more reports of issues or have been talked about previously, will be given some more emphasis compared to areas that might have only shown up in our analysis. So like we said, the list of 150 is a long list. We have done the analysis for every single one of these areas, and so every area that's been identified is on the list and it has been given consideration. But in order to progress with the program and look at what we might want to tackle first, I'm going to walk you through focusing on the top 30, just to give some examples of the areas and what's been presented near the top.
Thanks, Kate. Next slide, please. So essentially the top 30 is just a more bite-sized chunk. It doesn't mean that the projects from 31 through to 158 are unimportant or inconsequential. This is just us narrowing it down a bit the program, but also to make it a bit more manageable through the briefing process. So the list, I suppose, which everyone gets interested in, you can see on the list we have areas from across the district from a wide range of parts of the city. When we look down that list, there are many which will be known to yourselves and many which are known to us from past experience, and that shouldn't be too much of a surprise because we went through that moderation process. We thought about, was that flooding known to us and to others? So that bumped up more historically known areas into the higher ranked areas, into the higher ranks on the list, sorry.
So is this a hierarchical ranking, or are these just all at the same ranking at the moment?
Well, this is the identification of issues. So we looked at the flood pocket that we identified and then did the count and scored that count against the survey, the way the issues were prioritised through the survey. And so this is very much the highest scored moving down. So it is just a numeric approach on the issue. It is not a representation of the highest priority project that will go through into the program, because we need to work through that process. And I'll talk through that in the next few slides, but it's important to note that this is more around where we think there might be an issue, not necessarily the easiest place to start from a program perspective, or necessarily the best, in inverted commas, place to start. And there's lots of different things we want to throw into that mix and come back to you with later. So just looking at these areas individually, if we click on to the next slide, we're not going to run through all 30 of them, but we have pulled together a bit of a picture of what drove those issues to come to that top. And so the pie charts here, the different colours represent those different issues that were identified through the survey. So for example, the topmost pie chart there in dark in the blue identifies access issues, and moving around there in that flood pocket there are also some residential overflow potential there, risk identified through the modelling, and underflow in a different mix. So you can see within each flood pocket there's different issues that are driving that. If we flick onto the next slide, you can see across the city different issues drive different priorities. So you can see on this slide here some of those flood pockets more to the east seem to have more people affected, or a higher proportion in that flood pocket driven by access issues, for example. But there are other areas where some of those issues or problems have sort of bubbled to the surface. Next slide, please. And again, you can see we do get projects coming up and being prioritised, or sorry, flood pockets coming up and being prioritised with a different range of drivers. And just the next slide, please. So again, we get a similar story here. We get access issues are a key driver for many flood pockets. And for us, in terms of our past long-term planning work, we haven't had access issues as being a key driver. So we have really been focused on the levels of service and above floor flood risk. And that's why in that original list, you might have seen some flood pockets which haven't previously been projects within the long-term plan. And that's because this process is about reflecting on the issues that yourselves have identified as being of concern and putting that into the mix. So we are getting a outward look on what might be of importance here for this program. And on to the next slide, please. And you can see for Banks Peninsula in particular, we have a high proportion of access issues. So this is really around people not being able to access their properties through the state highway being flooded. But of course that was just the top 30. We quickly breezed through there. There were a number of other pockets that were identified by yourselves, and they are on the next slide. So we can see down here that we haven't gotten anything. We have analysed all the pockets that were, or the areas that were identified by yourselves, and put those onto the list. So what are we going to do next? Next slide, please. So that was really a quick fly through of what we have identified as the flood pockets and what issues are driving those flood pockets. That is not a prioritised physical works program, which is a sort of the next step for us. We need to go and think about each of those pockets. We need to think about what criteria are important for driving a physical works program, which is really what we want to be kicking on to, because you have allocated funding for it in FY27, so we're going to have something of some urgency. So we need to go through a process of continued definition and identification of potential options in the flood pockets, and then consider what those options might be in terms of cost and the like, and then re-rank those potential options to derive a physical works program. So we look at the issues, we think about how we might reduce the risk of those issues being present, and then say, how do we fold that into a physical works program? So that's really the next step for us. And when we do that, we're going to look at alignment with other programs and the like, funding from other sources that might help us deliver greater benefit for the community, that might bump projects up. And also we might think about council's policies and the like, and which might persuade us to move in different directions. So if we flick onto the next slide, please, you can see some initial criteria that we are suggesting we're going to apply when we're going to do a first pass essentially through those 158 projects, look at some criteria and think, where will we think about deriving options, and then when we work out options for the start of that list, we can bring that back to you and say, look, this is where we think, how we think we can resolve some of these issues and what it might cost and what those sorts of schemes might be. So that's really that next stage for us. But to get there, we need to think about those criteria and what makes a good option or not. So first we're suggesting is considering, is it council's responsibility to act? And there's a number of issues where it might be on the state highway, for example, which is outside our control, or it might be a rural area, for example, which might be an ECAN's responsibility, not ourselves. So we need to put that lens on first to say, is it appropriate for council to jump into the space? We're certainly going to be looking at the cost of the schemes. Is it is there a cost benefit that makes sense? We're not going to want to suggest a project that's completely out of whack with how much benefit it can deliver. Now it takes us quite a bit of work to get to that point because we need to understand cost, and to understand cost we need to do some sort of design work. So there's a bit of, it's easy to say cost benefit, but it takes a bit of work to get there. But we can also throw into that mix, are there other funding sources available? So that's great for us. So for example, some recent NZTA fundings come onto the table that will help push up projects which might have a lower benefit cost ratio would increase because that money will come into the pocket. Come into the bucket and reduce the cost for council. We'll also clearly be looking at effectiveness, will the schemes work, look at feasibility, could we actually deploy them, does it make sense, could we get consent for them and the like, and also looking at environmental impacts, are we going to have any adverse effects that might suggest that we might need to take a different course of action. And then there's an alignment, this criteria for alignment that's quite important for us. We don't want to start doing things that councils otherwise suggested would be inappropriate. So council's got a whole range of policies and plans, and we want to make sure that we're consistent with those. And also we want to be consistent with what other units are doing. If another unit is, say if the transport team might be coming and rebuilding a road, well, we'll want to jump in there at the same time and address any issues that we might have within this program so that we don't have to come and break open a new road that's been built. So we're certainly looking to align that sort of forward works view look and make sure that everything's buttoned in together. So we'll do that first look at, sorry, is there the next slide please? We'll look down the list to the right that we presented a couple of slides ago. We'll look at the criteria on the left and, as I say, put that first lens over it. Then we plan to bring a report back to you. Some initial findings, say in early September, and then we'll have to launch into some more design work and to derive the program, which we've laid out on the next slide. Oh, no more slides. Anyway, sorry, we must have that one mustn't been added too late. So, but essentially, we need to have a chunk of projects that we have in design that we can in this financial year coming, so that we can get into delivery in FY27. But that doesn't mean the design will stop. We'll have to have chunks of design moving, or every year we'll need to get projects into design so that we can get them into delivery thereafter. So what we will bring back to you in September might be a handful of projects that we want to get cracking on at the start, but that doesn't mean the others have been forgotten at all. They'll just be dealt with in time as the program rolls out.
A rolling program.
Yeah, so it's a rolling program. And once we get going and get started and have the sort of criteria signed off by yourselves and the like in these initial projects, we anticipate that we'll just report sort of that annual plan and long-term plan processes, and you can see them sort of bubbling up. So that's all I have for you today in terms of slides. Happy to
take some questions. Thank you, and we've got a few. So we'll kick off with Jake.
Oh, no.
You're okay. Tyler?
Good, guys. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Sweet. You might not be able to see me, but I've just got a question around scoping, how do I say this? I've got a question around scoping the works, because I'm noticing that quite a significant amount of Riccarton have a lot less reporting and engagement with our current system. So how do you weight that against other areas that report things quite significantly?
Well, we have looked at the complaints data as part of that moderation process, but we've also spoken to our operations team, taken a lot of direction from them. They've got decades of experience. So we don't have one source of information that we rely on solely in this process. So if there is knowledge with staff, that folds in, and I hope that will pick up some of the areas that might otherwise have fewer complaints, for example. But also we're relying on our first input data is the hydraulic modelling results, so the FUD modelling. and that is impartial to complaints. It really just looks at rainfall and the network. So our basic input data, although it does get moderated through that later process, should look uniformly everywhere.
Okay. And is sump clearing in terms of the delivery, is sump clearing a part of the program too? I mean, for Riccarton that has quite significant non-permeable surfaces, the problem that I noticed in the last flood was that the sumps were completely full with leaf fall. So does it have any sort of weighting upon your delivery program in this setting?
Well, this is really a physical works program, so looking at capital investment. So in terms of sump clearing, the answer is no, not really, because that's an operational response. But that said, if we have flood pockets identified, we'll be looking at the flood history as well, so we can see where if we don't have an issue in the flood model, for example, but we do have an issue on the ground where we can identify quite clearly that could be something operationally could be a challenge, or that we might need to deal in getting more water into the network, which is really the sumps. So possibly indirectly more than directly we'll be responding to that issue.
No, that's good to know. And really quickly is just with Wharenui Road, the intersection of Wharenui and Riccarton Road, there was significant flooding and it just got renewed with transport and Three Waters. I'm wondering if you could take that offline and just take a look at it. I reported that one because it was going across to Miles Toyota right across the road. So I just wanted to just flag that to the team.
That's a plug for a road in your ward and Miles Toyota. Thank you. Hey Tyler, by the way, I've noticed that when the last event, we were notified that there was going to be significant rain, and I went round my area and I commented and I sent some feedback to the Chief Executive of how prepared the staff were and how all the drains had been cleared of leaves really incredibly well in preparation. If you've got some areas that you think are being missed, I think send them through to make sure that the staff are onto those areas.
Thanks, Polly.
Okay, so Victoria.
Thanks, Tom and Kate. This is a really great piece of work, and I particularly like all the science, the analysis and everything behind it, and you presented it really well for us to understand. Thank you for that. I've got 3 questions. Firstly, in relation to the survey, did you get 100% elected member response?
We received 12 responses.
Survey to work.
We had plenty of reminders.
12, okay.
And they were anonymised, so we're not sure who.
They weren't?
They were anonymised for us.
Okay, that's interesting. I know you said that it's predominantly modelled on the current data and not necessarily the future projections, that a lot of people talk about. Does housing intensification come into this modelling and analysis at all? And the reason I ask that is and this isn't showing up here as a little bit around sort of on the outskirts of that, but it's got a really high water table. So does your housing intensification get overlaid over this at all in your analysis?
Not through this particular program. So this was focused on looking at where there might be legacy issues that would require some intervention. You have also allocated some money going forward into a program for responding to intensification. So we're also starting a process of looking at that, where intensification may contribute to increased runoff, for example, and there would need to be interventions to mitigate that. And in some cases, there may well be overlap with our legacy issues and our future improvements.
So that is a piece of work that you will look at.
Yes, it is.
And then the final thing is, who is the appropriate person for us to talk to offline, just so that we can understand a little bit more of our ward-specific information that is in here, please?
Well, questions should really go through the office of the CE, but they'll come back to Kate and I probably.
Thank you very much. Great piece of work. Thanks.
Thanks, Victoria. Mark.
Thank you. As I just stated, I was one of the ones that didn't respond because I couldn't get the survey to work. So
Sorry for that.
Although I do, the work you've come up with pretty good. Responded anyway, so well done. I'm, I guess, very lucky in my ward that a lot of my stuff is nuisance rather than serious, and some of it is long-standing. So one of the things in particular in my ward is Dress Smart Corner. It's been flooding for 30 odd years. It's a lot better than it used to be. We did remodel the intake somewhat, but there still seems to be a lag in the drainage event each time we get a major flood, like the weekend. Used to be days, now it's hours, so thank you for that. And I guess really with this, it's back to the sump clearing that was mentioned by Tyler. Is that something we could look at doing as a council to try and do away with a lot of the nuisance flooding reports we get, and sort of do a concerted effort with this, perhaps at the start of this program, to clear out a lot of the walkways and the sumps to get the water draining off the road quicker, to get a lot of satisfaction very quickly.
Yeah, but that is operational.
No, it's operational, but we could
Tom's
use
the
that.
surface water engineer.
Yeah, I realise.
It's quality. He doesn't do something.
Some of that surface water's not like
So the infrastructure response is something that we can look at, not the operational, as Tom said.
Yeah.
But for example, some of the NZTA funding that's been allocated to the transport team could be used for upgrading those sumps, for example, and we could look at areas where there is blockage issues and actually changing the infrastructure there to try and mitigate that.
Capacity, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. I think the operational clearing not, but certainly changing the infrastructure to reduce that is on the table.
So that said, the operations team worked very hard to identify critical sumps, prioritise those before storms, get them cleaned. But and every sump is on a cleaning rotation, so they do get, I can't tell you off the top of my head the frequency they get cleaned at, each individual sump, but they certainly are a focus for the operations team.
So it would be something for us as like members as we see the seriously blocked.
Tim?
Thank you. Just to remind my colleagues, the operations team say it can be less than 3 hours from a clean sump to a full one with leaf drop, etc. So I know that they're looking on the hills with regards to changing the design of the grates to work on that. So they're not kind of sitting there waiting for them to fill. They're going around. Just Tom, boy, we've been here for a while, haven't we, with the flooding? My thoughts are that there's no question with regards to it's got to be residential properties protected first, whether it's above floor and below, because I went with staff at Waimea Terrace and others looking at those families, and the ones that missed out on the buyouts because they weren't flooded above floor were just as badly affected, if not worse, because of the kind of hangover of the flooding that contaminated, etc. But also the small businesses rather than big commercial, small businesses like the Beckenham shops. I think there was some around Barrington, because when we visited the staff, and I visited some of those families who were flooded above floor and under floor, their businesses sadly had also been affected. So their income was gone. So for me personally, it'll be that those three things will be the priority, because streets are, as we know, are designed to flood, so let them flood. But it's the private properties and the locally owned small retail type commercial are the priorities for me. Let the rest flood, but that's designed to. Thank you.
That's right, and I agree that even though we can't quantify the amount of financial loss that businesses might face, we do know that there is financial loss, and it can be 1 day or half a day, or 2 days. So
when you go to a family whose house has been flooded to, like 200-300 mils in the whole house, but their business has also been affected, their concern is they can't insure, and they couldn't get insurance in the end for their house, which affects their business and their family. So, and that's why I supported family going around with Mark Christensen, who's managed to dodge this one for some time. So, anyway.
okay, so that's kind of feeding into analysis of the criteria. Celeste?
Thank you. Awesome work. With the NZTA funding, is there an opportunity to get more information about that? Sounds like there's been some areas that have been have they been approved, or is it you've got?
Making it worse. I'll give you a brief update on what's happened, but it might be, if you want more detail, then we'll have to send it around via a memo. But there was a resilience fund that was released as part of the NZP. The work, there's criteria on the work, and the staff put forward a range of different projects and issues that they thought could be addressed, and some of them were accepted. We've got, is it 3 or 4 areas?
3.
3 for Edgware, Sumner, and Marine Parade. Yeah. So there's 3 areas, there's criteria around the work that we need to do to get that funding, but it ties in with this work, so we're looking to tie in with these guys and make sure we do the work together and maximise the value of that funding.
Yeah, it's great to see there's another pot of funding there. I know you probably won't have any specifics, but in terms of general timelines, do you know, because that has to be spent within a certain amount of time, I assume, so we'll come back with more information about that.
It needs to be spent. It needs to be spent by the end of June 27. So it's the end of the NLTP period. It won't. Basically, what they're saying is you won't be able to carry it forward into the next NLTP period.
So just final one for me. So if some of those are sitting in the, say, top 30, 40, they would come out of that pot and kind of move across to the other pot, but the work would kind of, in terms of prioritisation.
Potentially, and it might depend a little bit on the scale of the work. So it might be that the NZTA can only go so far because they're focused on the road. We might be focused on additional residential floors, for example. We might extend a scheme or something by using the money together to achieve the best value for the community.
Sorry, actually, and you're coming back with the top 30, is that right? Or is there a kind of a hard cut-off with that?
No, there's no hard cut-off at all. The first process we're going to go is look through it all, apply the criteria and say what makes sense here, where are potential quick wins, where does it align with the funding, where does it align with other programs, and come back with a suggested start of the program. It won't be the full program, of course, because the program runs for, I think it's sort of 8 years or so, or could continue, of course, at your own discretion. So yes, it's what we do need is that kickstart, because we have funding in FY27. We need something to sort of get going on quite quickly. So that'll be the focus of the next stage of planning, is deriving the physical works program and bring just the start of that. It won't be all of it to you in that instance.
So much work goes into this before any physical work starts. Aaron?
Yeah, a couple of possible. First one is much of our flooding affected by king tides, high tides, so on and so forth?
Certainly in parts of the city. Of course, the closer to the coast, the more you're influenced by the tide. And there are some parts of the city where we see some flood risk where that's not related to rainfall. Right. So where there's challenges with holding out the tide. So that's
this not related to rainfall, so flooding.
Well, for example, I've seen water on roads in some parts of Avondale, for example.
When it's not raining.
When it's not raining, yes. So that's about potentially, groundwater coming in and not being able to get out against the tide or something, or we've got a lot of work planned in, particularly in that area with the Atakura River corridor work.
So then and I know it's been around for decades, but the old floodgate conversation, where's that at nowadays?
You mean at Brooklands?
No, the floodgates at the end of the estuary,
Floodgates.
Sure. So there was a
hold out and then comes in. Yeah. So where's that at?
Yeah, there was a pre-feasibility study done through the Land Drainage Recovery Program. I think it was 2015. I'm looking at Sylvia. She's nodding. At that point in time, we investigated 2 different potential alignments. We brought that report back to council at that point in time, and the direction from council was we needed to take it any further. And so since that point in...
I was on my sabbatical, so what was the reason? There's a lot of bad decisions making.
Well, I can't comment on the quality of the decision at all, but I'd suggest there were some significant environmental challenges that were of concern to the council at that point in time. If I remember rightly, I think the report identified that there was a better benefit cost associated with doing stop banks and the work that we're promoting through the Atakura River corridor, for example, was better aligned with council policies, better value for money, rather than looking at an estuary tidal barrier.
Right. So longer term, that's not needed. So because isn't the ocean getting higher?
Long term, the question, that's a great question for the Coastal Hazards Adaptation Planning Program. And they've got a lot of work to do, they're planning to do a lot of work, and that is their focus. We've got a whole team, potentially teams focused on that.
And it's cross-discipline teams as well, so if you're looking at
Yanni?
Thank you. So just in terms of Richardson and Clarendon Terrace, I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can work alongside other units of council? Because one of the issues in this area is there's a cycle lane that may go there. There's tree planting plan that we're consulting on now, and there's a number of issues with the road condition and the interface between the river, the road and the footpath. So I'm just wondering, what would be the best way to get an integrated approach to this corridor that addresses some of those issues? Oh, and there's also safety issues, particularly on Clarendon with speeding traffic and blind corners and things like that. So yeah, like when it floods, obviously that it's I think the above floor flooding has significantly reduced, but it is still quite a hazardous area because of the way the river and the road.
an example of your tidal flooding issues.
Yeah, so it is a narrow corridor through there, undoubtedly, between the properties and the river. That makes it very challenging for managing a whole lot of infrastructure in that corridor. There will be significant challenges through there in finding options that are cost effective, and also Council has previously identified that it wouldn't pursue low stop banks in there, for example, so would have to take some cognizance of those earlier decision making. But in terms of alignment with other units, clearly when we think about infrastructure in any corridor, we need to think about the impacts of it, and we look to our colleagues as key stakeholders and just part of the team, really, not just a stakeholder. We work together. So I don't see any barrier there. If there's projects and objectives that other units need to achieve, well, we look to achieve those in tandem and make sure that we prioritise our programs so that we achieve best value for the community, basically.
Well, I think, sorry, Councillor, just to finish on that, just to follow on. I think the fact that Transport reps sitting here as well as Three Waters reps shows you that we're already working across units on this program.
Thank you.
Is there any, are you talking to Parks about the tree planting? I don't understand enough about the impact of tree planting on flooding. It would seem to me quite dangerous where you've got very low visibility, particularly at night. Like when we've had the recent flooding events, I've been down this area and there's no signage, there's very low visibility of the road and the river, and people would easily just drive in. But
So the question, are you talking to Parks as well?
So I'm just really trying to understand, is there benefits to planting in terms of flooding, or how does that risk assessment get done?
Yeah, so we are working with the Parks team around the planting plan that's being prepared, and also the planning to implement the guidance plan for that lower part of the river. And so there are a number of considerations around. So looking at the tree planting plan, for example, water staff have given advice on where perhaps not to plant trees because of the impact on flooding in areas where trees could be planted, and looking at the various things that are desired for that corridor, so you get your tree planting, cycleways, there's also the known flooding issue, and so we need to consider as part of this and that wider planning the feasibility of all of that, and it may be that some of these it's not feasible to fit trees, cycleway, stop banks, everything we might want in that space, and so yes, through that corridor, talking to Parks.
So can we bring that? I'm just trying to understand how we get synergy with that work. So the tree planting is going to happen now, but we haven't done the flooding assessment or the roading assessment. So is there a way that we can bring forward the other work streams on that particular one?
Yeah, so you're talking about alignment, timing alignment, but Tom said you are addressing
Also
that.
planning, because if residents are being asked to give feedback on what
Planning.
types of trees to go in, but
So-
we've actually got some other issues around.
And you're sure, Yanni, that the timing is
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've got alignment up there as one of our key criteria in terms of deriving physical. That will push and pull. So it might be that some projects we might defer because another team don't quite have the money and we want to align, but equally we might go the other way if another team unit has got.
I'm happy to bring forward planning money for the cycleway if that's helpful, because I think that's pretty a major decision that we need to make around route selection for this corridor, and we still haven't done that.
So you,
Well, I'd suggest that might be another good thing to come back to the Office of the CE.
yes,
if you've
and
got
get some advice on that.
Ideas or suggestions.
And just the other thing just to pick up on the point that Victoria made, I'm increasingly concerned at the impact of infill housing in terms of creating additional flooding. I'm just getting a lot of anecdotal reports from residents. What's the process when we do get flooding to ground truth? What's happening at a local level? Do we go out and look at these hotspots and take measurements, or do we go to areas where we've seen an increase in complaints? Like, how do we get the data to understand what the impact is?
So we have a number of permanent monitoring sites that are in place along key waterways, and we're looking at expanding that permanent network, so that sends data feeds through to council staff, and they can actively manage that, and we also use that for our modelling and our response. During events, we also do send out staff to known areas, and we're looking at formalising that more, I suppose, in terms of areas to monitor, and also building on the resource in the wider industry to look at areas to go and check on. Also looking at how we might potentially leverage new technologies to be able to do that for us. And then, like we mentioned, we also use Snaps and Solve to get community feedback as well.
Thank you. Okay, James?
Thank you. Just to echo what others have said, I think it's an excellent piece of work, so thank you very much. Just wondered if you could talk me through when there's a lack of alignment with some of the local priorities, how we could look at altering potentially the prioritisation or elevate certain projects. And I guess an example I'm talking about would be, say, Brenchley Ave, for example, not taking away anything from the work that's been done here, but in terms of a local context and overlay with that local representation, that's been identified as, I think it's like the top board priority for the community board area.
So this program and therefore the analysis we've done is a council and a district-wide initiative, and so we've taken that equal lens across the entire district. But like we say, it is your program, so we've presented the results of the analysis. You are able to change those rankings if you will choose to, but in terms of that wasn't the data that's gone into that.
But there's obviously, so we've got a decision point that, you know, collectively we can work through a prioritisation sort of process, and there's obviously trade-offs with that, I appreciate. But I guess that's just the nature of overlaying the representative element and stuff to it. Okay.
Councillors might remember the genesis for this program in the first place was that we had at least half a dozen different proposals, it might have been in the LTP and everyone said, well, these are the priority for the city, and that was the whole genesis of bringing this together so that you could make those strategic decisions. When we went back out to you for a survey and asked for those other sites, they got fed into it as well. So it really is looking at surface flooding issues strategically across the city as a council group, as opposed to those individual things. And as I said, understanding exactly what you said, Councillor, and the same discussions with the Deputy Mayor as well around the priority of those things, and that was the whole purpose of doing this and actually getting some science behind it.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Nell?
With those analysis rings and the different colours, there's quite a lot that shows residential overflow. Was there any overflow flooding in residential properties in the last event? Because this is quite historic, isn't it? I was just wondering how much this was shown, I guess, in the last event that we had.
Yeah, and so what you've seen on the slides is where there's been potential for that based on the modelling, which would be worst case scenarios of rain in those particular areas, and also assumptions around the floor level. Fortunately, we didn't see all of that play out in the recent flooding at the start of May, for example, and a couple of reasons for that around the rainfall being quite varied across the district. There's very heavy rainfall in Banks Peninsula, for example, less so in other parts of the district. So we don't necessarily see those exact floor levels flooded in every event, and some of them haven't necessarily flooded before. It's more about taking that starting point of where there might be potential for that to occur.
Thank you. Well, that's perfect timing, just about. We're a couple of minutes ahead. But thank you very much. Nice to see you all. And, particularly that alignment thing is really important, and seeing all the various teams, the transport team as well in here, is quite indicative to how you are all working together. So, and I appreciate how complex this is and how all councillors are going to want their bit and their ward addressed, including me. But we're in your hands for this now because you're the experts. So thank you very much. See you again.
Is there a process to go back to the community boards as well?
So for the next 45 minutes, we are on PC 14 and a briefing on the Minister's alternative recommendations. So welcome Ike and Brent. So you're free to go. Welcome.
Thank you.
Fire away.
Thank you very much for hosting us to discuss where we're at in terms of the Change 14 decision making. If you could just go to the next slide. So today what we're going to cover off is effectively what the outcome is of the decision making from the Minister, as you will have no doubt read. The effect of that decision making, what has been rejected, that effect, and also the deferred recommendations. And we'll cover off what it means in terms of the residential pathways. That was also an alternative recommendation that was sent to the Minister as well. And discuss the next steps for Plan Change 14 and also for these alternative recommendations as well. Next slide.
How much longer the Zoom interview will be?
No, but they've just got to the meeting part.
Yeah.
It could have been awkward. Was that someone's phone call? Sorry, I carry on.
That's all right. So to begin with, I think it's useful if I can ask Brent to cover off some of the legal ins and outs of what the decision making means.
Thanks, Ike. So Ike's list of topics, the first one was the effect of the Minister's decision, and this is the slide about that. So the effect of the Minister's decision. As you know, the Minister was required to consider whether to accept a recommendation from the IHP or an alternative recommendation from the Council. They were the two choices for the Minister. And the Minister's, you've seen the memo that sets out the matters that the Minister has accepted and rejected, and Ike's going to talk to those in more detail. That is the end of the decision making on that part of Plan Change 14. There's no right of appeal for anyone. There's no challenge to the Minister's decision other than, as there is for all administrative decisions by anyone, potential judicial review. The provisions that the Minister has decided on are now in effect in the district plan. So the resource consent planners are applying them right now. The Minister's decision has immediately changed the plan, and the Council's alternative recommendations are irrelevant in relation to the operation of the plan. What the Minister's decision didn't do was make any zoning decisions outside of the intensification areas that I refers to as the policy 3 areas. So that's still a decision that the Council needs to make by the end of this year, unless the new legislation enables the Council to opt out of making a decision on the balance of Plan Change 14. So that's the effect of the decision. Back to you, Ike.
Thank you. Go to the next slide, thanks. And the next one after that, thank you. So, like Brent said, the decision making that Council has undertaken so far is limited to those policy 3 areas because of the I guess the separated out path that the Minister set out for decision making for the balance of Plan Change 14, which is solely the medium density areas, versus within and around those commercial centres. We are still required to make a decision on the balance of that by the 12th of December this year, subject to any other opt-out decision that gets made, which we'll discuss a little bit later on as well. The only exception in terms of the zoning extent comes to the Riccarton Bush qualified matter area, because the alternative that was set was for the zoning within the full extent of the qualifying matter. The qualifying matter around Riccarton Bush, I'll cover off a little bit later on, effectively covers all the areas that interface with the bush, and so that is on the northern side beyond policy 3. So that's the only real extension, if you will, of decision making from what council have done. So on the image there you can see effectively the stuff that's been decided spatially on Plan Change 14, and the balance obviously is everything between that as well. Next slide. So the local centre intensification precinct is one of the alternative recommendations from council that the Minister accepted. That applies specific controls around specific centres that were at a scale of growth potential otherwise that met the criteria under policy 3D of the NPSUD. So that applies to those specific centres that's listed there, those 8 centres. And effectively what the overlay does is promotes comprehensive multi-unit development by having more relaxed controls when it comes to recession planes, effectively along the first portion of the site, about 60% of the parcel depth, or about 20 metres. Enables heights up to 12 metres, which aligns with the overall height for the medium density in those areas. So the only change really from the council's final position through Plan Change 14 is that the spatial extent of where that applies aligns with where the hearings panel landed for the catchments for those centres. We had different, the council position was that different centres had different walking catchments based on their scale and alike. Some of them went up to 400 metres, for example. For all of these, it's a smaller 200 metre catchment. It's static for all of those centres. So like Brent said, that's in effect from the date of decision being last week.
Less housing.
Next slide, please.
Sorry, does that mean less developments enabled in those areas?
No more. No. It's increasing it because of the scale of those centres. Yeah, so it's a greater enablement for those recession planes. There's no recession planes for the first 20 metres of parcel depth or 60%, whichever's lesser.
Sorry, just because it's quite technical, but just the 200 metre walking catchment versus the 400. We had a bigger catchment. They've gone to a smaller catchment.
Yes, yeah, and so all the only change really from what we had originally proposed for the local centre intensification precinct is that the spatial extent of where that applies simply aligns with where the catchment is, where the hearings panel recommended being 200 metres.
So effectively that's limiting the development around those catchments because you've got a lesser catchment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The only other difference is that the height that was enabled as well. The council's final position was a 14 metre permitted height. And of course where the hearings panel landed was that 14 metres was the permitted height that they recommended for high density residential zone, not for this, and so they reduced that height to 12 metres. So that's been aligned as well in terms of the precinct as well. Okay. In terms of the next accepted alternate recommendation, there was a small discrepancy, if you will, for the zoning extent for council site on Johnson and Milton Street, which Christchurch and NZ have taken on to develop, and I think recently it's been announced that Fletchers will develop. I think there's some 80 units there. There was an issue there in terms of the high density extent not reflecting the updated parcel configuration. So Christchurch and NZ concurrently with Plan Change 14 through a subdivision process for a boundary adjustment, it simply was that the zoning extent didn't reflect the current boundary. So this fixes that to align with parcel extents, which is best practice, and avoids any other unnecessary consenting complexity because of misalignment with zoning for Fletchers as they progress through the development. Next slide, please. The last alternative recommendation that was accepted by the Minister regards 25 Deans Avenue, the former stockyard site. So Council had two alternative recommendations regarding this site. One was to change the zoning, and a separate one was to change the height that was enabled. So the height that's enabled already for this site, there's a specific overlay that existed before Plan Change 14 that enabled 20 metre building height, about 5 or 6 stories, and that has been increased to 36 metres by the Minister's decision, again in effect today. And so that would enable some 10 to 11, maybe 12 stories to occur over that site. The zoning, however, does remain in a medium density typology, and I'll cover that a little bit later on as well. However, it's important to recognise that the rationale in terms of the greater height enablement is because of the Minister's consideration of Policy 3 being in a near proximity, if you will, to the Riccarton Centre. Next slide, please. And the next one after that, thank you. So in terms of the rejected alternative recommendations that the Council's put forward, the first is the sunlight access qualifying matter. So Council had proposed a nuance of the MDRS recession plane. The MDRS recession plane lies at the parcel boundary, taken at 4 metres at a 60-degree angle. It's effectively the building envelope that you're able to be constructed within, and that was regardless of the site's orientation. The Council position was taken at 3 metres, so a metre less, and then applied an angle of between 50 to 60-degree angle based on its orientation. In terms of the rejection, the Council could potentially make the same recommendation again to the Minister when it comes to making the decision on the balance of Plan Change 14 for medium density areas, but considering the Minister's land, the Minister's view is fairly clear on that, so that'll be up to Council to consider in terms of whether or not it wishes to proceed with that at a later date. Next slide, please. So one more, thank you. Great. And so the next alternative recommendation that was rejected by the Minister regards the Riccarton Bush interface area, like I mentioned. Council had proposed that it was a qualifying matter considering the significance of the Bush site, and the Council alternative was twofold. One was within the qualifying matter extent to maintain medium density, and the second was to have an overlay in some parts of that reduced building heights effectively to 2 stories and associated density controls as well. The Minister's rejection means effectively that everything that's shown in orange in that map there will be high density zone rather than medium density zoning, and also in that circled area in the black outline further to the north gets rezoned to being medium density residential area as well. And that's what I alluded to earlier when I talked about the extension, if you will, of zoning that Council has decided because of the alternative that went beyond the Policy 3 catchment. So there's a small increase on the northern side there as well. It's worth noting that two, I guess, prominent qualifying matters for this area still apply. One is the airport noise qualifying matter, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, but in a nutshell it applies over this entirety of this area, including the medium and the high density area. And it requires that any consent that is of 4 units or more meets specific acoustic controls and alike, but also notification or written approval, if you will, from the airport is required. And in the absence of that, would be notified to the airport, and they could object to the consent as well. So there's still quite a fair restriction of intensification within the area because the airport noise qualifying matter. The second one as well is that there is an existing restriction that's in place there that the IHP accepted which is a 10-metre building setback from the predator-proof fence, and that continues to apply within this area. So whereas the council position or the council staff position before the recommendation was that building heights within this area for the high density zoning, on the qualified matter to one side, would be 22 metres, and then obviously within the qualified matter would be reduced down to being the medium density at 12 or less at 8 metres within some of the overlay. Where we are now is that with the high density framework applying as per the IHP's recommendation, 14 metres is permitted, so lesser, and then there's a building setback of 10 metres from effectively from the boundary of bush to some of those residential areas. Next slide, please. The next part of we'd like to cover off is the high density response around Riccarton, Hornby and Linwood. We had various alternatives for these three centres, ranging from different catchments to different heights within high density for Linwood and for Hornby, as well as different heights for the commercial elements of Linwood as well. All of those alternatives were rejected by the Minister, and the IHP's recommendation instead applies. What that means is effectively what you can see on the image there, that all of those orange areas become high density zoning. There is no specific overlay for building heights as per the proposal from Council. 14 metre permitted building height, as I said earlier, for high density continues for that high density zoning. Also within the commercial sites for all of those, the heights remains as per the IHP recommendation of 32 metres rather than the 20 or 22 metres that we had for Hornby and Linwood respectively in the alternative. Next slide, please. So this table here provides a quick summary of the controls as per the IHP recommendation versus the council's alternative that the Minister had rejected. So like I said, 14 metres being permitted, and then within the commercial zoning, so the town centre zoning for Hornby and Linwood, 32 metres, and for Riccarton obviously as well, but we didn't have an alternative for that. Next slide, please. The next aspect to cover off is the Pier Street medium density zoning. The council alternative was effectively that it didn't feel that it was met the test under policy 3D, the MPSUD for greater intensification. So it was keeping the status quo largely as is. The Minister's decision means that there's an acceptance of the IHP's recommendation, which is the static 200 metre walking catchment from the local centre that's there. And applies the MDRS medium density framework to extent. There's only a very small nuance with what I highlight. It's hard to see there, but the very top northern aspect there, there's a slightly different colour of bright yellow, which is residential suburban. That does exist because of some of the flooding restriction that's there. That hearing's been accepted that operative zoning should hold if there's I believe the threshold was 70% coverage of the site or more, so that is retained in those particular two sites. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, Council's alternative was twofold for the Stockyard site in Deans Avenue. The second aspect was regarding the zoning, and the Council's position was that it should be mixed-use zone for the site. The Minister's decision is to accept the IHP's recommendation, which is to apply a medium density within that area. And that is because the IHP had come to the conclusion that under the MPSUD it was outside of a policy 3 catchment from Riccarton. And so it was simply seen as being part of the medium density, here, there and everywhere other than the policy 3 directed intensification around centres. So the Minister, like Brent said earlier, his decision making is limited to what Council's position was in the alternative and what the IHP was. And so his decision was only between mixed use and medium density. And so that's why we have now medium density zoning applying to the site. So it will change from being RMD, the former medium density, to being MRZ, a real fundamental difference as such, but we'll have an increased overlay of 36 metres. And so in terms of the overarching framework that exists on that site, it's as per standard medium density, but it has an increased building height response. What it does mean, however, is that like with any medium density site, or for that matter high density as well, any development that is 4 units or more still requires resource consent, and there's an urban design consideration for scale of units for any development of that site. So in terms of the effects assessment, the effect of building height and its bulk because of that height is the only matter that's disregarded, and that urban design of that and the function and so on and so forth is still considered because of the threshold of consenting from 4 or more units for the stockyard site. Next slide, please. The next aspect is regarding city spine qualifying matter. This was to reflect the strategic significance of this twofold corridor and to protect any future need for growth in terms of expansion of the corridor within this area. Council's alternative was to retain the previously operative roading setbacks for these areas of between 4.5 to 2 metres, depending on where the previous zoning fell. The ministers rejected that and stuck with the hearings panel recommendation, which is effectively just carte blanche MDRS, which is 1.5 metre setback static throughout all of the medium and high density areas that applies. So in the image, it's important to highlight that the yellow there is highlighted, just indicates where the city spine falls, but its application in terms of setbacks is only where zoning has been decided. So those coloured areas around the specific centres is obviously the only areas where council and the minister have decided on zoning. So those are the only areas that applies in the interim. And as you no doubt know, have been briefed on for some time, there's an ongoing program for mass rapid transit in this area, and it's part of a wider program. So council will be looking at throughout that program of any other avenues for corridor protection as part of the mass rapid transport.
Oh, sorry, can you just explain that a wee bit more in sort of layman's terms for me? So effectively am I right in saying what you've said there is that we wanted a bigger setback to protect those corridors for future public transport, and the minister has said don't have the setback on the routes where he wants public transport. Correct.
Yeah, that's a good summary of it, yeah.
MRT, it's not just
It's just billions extra.
So how does that make sense? Because
It doesn't.
like I would have thought if he's effectively saying on one hand intensify, which is what he's basically said. On the other hand, he's saying, but don't worry on the key corridors. So what, in your expert view, what am I missing here?
without criticising the minister, of course.
They don't want more public transport, otherwise they fund it.
Yeah, exactly.
And
But
then
like,
taking
what am I missing? Yeah, because that's why I thought we've had the whole thing
It's mostly taking money off.
It's not going
Yes,
to.
Yes, the question is, did anyone come and eyeball Papanui Road and Rickerton Road? Personally, but anyway.
For any program of this scale and regarding any kind of roading infrastructure, putting plan change 14 to the side, the standard process would be to designate the corridor. That means you've got notice of requirement, the requiring authority being council and the other PT organisation that has effectively exclusive right or management within that corridor. And that usually lasts for a period of 10 years or so. Given the scale and acceleration of plan change 14 and the competing timeline with MRT, it simply isn't possible to do a designation. So we were forced to go through an avenue of stating that it would be a restriction as a qualifying matter. The qualifying matter restriction, in terms of the prerequisites that's set under the Act, there's a number of prerequisites that effectively, if you meet those, it's an easier path. because it's recognised in the Act that it's necessary, like matters of national significance or alike, right? Because of this, and because of it not being listed in one of those prerequisites in the Act, it meant there's a harder test to go through as a qualifying matter, much harder test to go through. And quite simply, as per, where the minister's landed, he hasn't considered that it met that test. And so it's simply that we have tested this, and the minister's tested this, and the IHP have tested this against the regulation and the mechanism for protection. In the future, it may be that a designation would proceed, depending on where we land with the MRT and the like. And this decision does not restrict us from doing that into the future.
And I won't hold up, sorry, but I feel like I've missed something, because fundamentally everything I've read, he said, no, let's intensify these areas because they're going to be our main corridors. But then he's effectively said, but don't have the setbacks, so you can build on those areas so that if they're needed in the future, we would just buy the houses.
Can I have another go at the layperson's terms? So in layperson's terms, the minister hasn't said don't protect the corridor. The minister has said under this plan change, under the law that applies to this plan change, he couldn't protect the corridor any more than he has done.
Because he didn't have the evidence for it.
No, because the law didn't let him. Because the section of the RMA that applies to this plan change didn't let him. That's what he said.
Yeah.
So what the council needs to do is what it says in the last line on that PowerPoint, which is staff are considering alternative means of protection. And that's what I was referring to a moment ago when he was talking about designation. Designation is putting a special sort of overlay in the plan saying you're not allowed to build in that designated area.
So we'll have to do another piece of work now,
Yep.
because the law the government made
Yep.
doesn't protect the bit that they actually want.
Yep.
How does that make sense?
There'll be significant cost to that piece of work, I assume.
Yeah, so there was recently an information session on.
Hang on, sorry, Mark.
There was recently an information session on mass rapid transit, which the team gave, and we'll be coming back to you with further detail around the resourcing of that work. But effectively, it's that project is to go about getting that land protected for the purpose of mass rapid transit, even if the investment and the implementation of mass rapid transit is 30 years into the future. That project is to protect the land.
Well, that's right, but then we've just had another briefing about alignment, how important that is. So if we don't get that piece of work done in time, and this is operative now, and as Councillor McDonald said, we see big builds going up, that's going to cost us a lot of money to be able to implement our MRT in the future. It's crazy.
I think you've just done a great summary of what the evidence was for the qualifying matter, because that's exactly our point.
But the fact they didn't agree with the... No.
Yeah, and like Brent said, it just comes down to the fickle nature of the Act. It's quite a blunt instrument.
Is there no other way the minister could intervene in this particular one to use some powers?
Well, that's something that staff will be coming back to you about, because we're all agreed this is a big issue.
Yeah.
It needs to be solved. We're going to come back to you with options for solving it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry, Karen.
Sorry for holding it up.
No, because as Councillor Johansson referred before, it is highly technical, so it's quite good on the slide to actually clarify stuff that we're stuck on. So far ahead.
Thank you. Next slide, please. The next one regards the airport noise influence area, the qualifying matter there, as mentioned earlier. The Minister has accepted the IHP's recommendation over the alternative. Effectively, where the IHP landed was that, like I said, at a threshold of 4 or more units, that there would be a resource consent requirement. That's the same, as I said, for the standard zone framework anyway, so that threshold is really unchanged. And at the same time, if you do have to go through resource consent under the overlay, you have to get written approval from the airport, from CIL as well, and if not obtained, they will be notified as well, and they could submit an opposition for your consent as well. Council's alternative was to change that threshold to apply from 3 units, to be more restrictive about when consent is required, but at the same time seek that the notification clause would be removed, so more leniency there. It would still mean, however, that under the Act, Council would require going through a process of identifying whether or not they are an affected party on a case-by-case basis as well. Long story short, the IHP's recommendation and the Minister's adoption of that effectively means that the notification mechanism as existed before Plan Change 14 continues to exist through Plan Change 14 and will be applied for units or more. Next slide, please. Regarding the Papanui War Memorial Avenues, the Minister's accepted the IHP recommendation that there isn't any specific consideration of the heritage features. Council had an alternative in the plan that was seeking that if there was any breach of building height, building setback or coverage, that there would be specific consideration of the effects on those heritage items. And so that simply isn't included in terms of the matters of discretion for consenting because of the Minister's decision. However, Plan Change 13 has proposed that those avenues are heritage items, and so those controls are still in effect because of the immediate legal effect of anything that's notified through heritage through Plan Change 13, and that'll be considered through the hearing next week. So we'll wait and see what happens on that front. And that's, to be clear, the protection would say items for those streets, for the trees and for the plaques for those trees as well. Next slide, please. The Minister did defer decision making on 3 alternatives that the Council put forward because of the fact that zoning hadn't been decided for those areas. The Minister considered that the qualifying matter effectively qualifies how the zone would be applied. And so in his mind, he couldn't consider it in isolation. And so he'd be considering that when the zoning is decided. So what that means is that there's no change to the existing district plan as for now, because no decision has been simply made for those areas. The likes of Desbury and Antonio Hall listings in terms of how they're managed will be considered as part of Plan Change 13, like I said, the hearings next week. It's not considering the merits of it being listed, it's more how it's measured. So in terms of the mechanisms for having it completely delisted, it's solely within Plan Change 14. Plan Change 13 isn't considering that. It's an important distinction to make. And so Council, it's important to recognise that Council could make a separate decision, for example, before it decides on the balance of Plan Change 14, for the zoning of those 3 areas, or those 2 areas, or whichever the case may be, and then refer it back to the Minister or tell him at least that we've made a zoning decision so he can reconsider it. Or the staff position or preference really is that that gets done when Council decides on the balance of Plan Change 14 in a more integrated fashion to avoid those isolated pockets really of zoning for those 3 areas. So it's a question that we have that we're very keen to have feedback on in terms of what we have to prepare going forward. So we welcome views on the merits of either of those options and what you would prefer. Next slide, please. And one more, thanks. Part of what the Council objected and referred to the Minister is regarding what's known as residential pathways that the IHP recommended, and then we worked through various clarifications afterwards. The pathways effectively were to provide an option to any applicant to say you can choose to wholeheartedly have the pre-PC14 controls or the Plan Change 14 controls as they are. The IHP came to the conclusion that there were elements within the overarching framework that was set that were more restrictive than the existing controls, and so it wanted to provide a means to be able to protect for both because of the conclusions that were reached in the High Court on what's known as the Waikanai decision. And so it was, in their view, applying that precedent. The Council staff position was that the framework and the mechanisms that underpinned that didn't function, to put it simply, and that it diluted those two frameworks together, that it was quite difficult to come to any conclusions on various aspects of consenting when it came to notifications, decisions, permitted baselines, or project information memorandum of what's permitted for a site. The Minister has chosen to go with the IHP's recommendation, which is that some applicants will be able to apply for consent for both pathways. And again, in our view, and the staff advice supports this to date, there's significant ambiguity that comes with that, of having those two frameworks to apply simultaneously. And so there's a potentially a large amount of work that we have to do in-house to come to some resolve, I guess, for how we are going to apply that in practice. I don't have an answer for you today, but we're working through that.
It's like a bob each way, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So it makes it extremely difficult to say, well, what is anticipated for that site when you have two frameworks applying simultaneously, and that they can be fluid as well. As I said, staff are considering how this is applied, and there is potentially also a prospect of a bespoke plan change that is required to rectify this outstanding issue with the pathways. And I want to touch on that a little bit, and that is that no doubt you're aware that the government intends to repeal the RMA within its current term and introduce a Planning Act and the other act, which name escapes me, regardless, change the RMA. And it is doing so with what's called the EAG blueprint, which is the expert advisory panel group, I should say, blueprint. And as part of that, it's introduced this concept of deeming. And so effectively what it means, and this is, I just have to stress, conceptual at this stage because we don't have a draft bill in front of us and all the rest of it, but government's made it quite clear to date that the EAG blueprint is what they are working off. And within that document, it talks about this deeming principle. The deeming principle effectively is that anything that's been done under the RMA prior to the new Planning Act coming into force is deemed to have been done under the new Act. And so effectively is to be blunt, a copy and paste of what exists into a new framework. And with that in mind, it's, in our opinion, very much in Council's best interest to make sure that the product that we have when that begins is fit for purpose. Because by all accounts, the government is interested in transposing what we have across the country into a new framework as quickly as possible, hence the deeming kind of direction that's there and that mechanism that exists. And so, like I said, we're considering the effect of this matter and potentially other matters as well, and whether or not a bespoke plan change is needed to ensure that the product that we have, that we're translating into this new framework, is fit for purpose. So that's about it in terms of our considerations that we have to date. We don't have any other thoughts on that as of yet. We want to make you aware about frame of reference going forward and the necessity for a patch up, I guess, plan change potentially for some of these aspects. Next slide, please. So we're anticipating that next week we'll have the public notice for the Minister's decision. What that means is that while under the Act the decisions are treated as operative and fully in effect from day one of the Minister's decision of Thursday last week, having the public notice means it's fully operative. There's no real change in terms of consenting. It just makes it easier in terms of the discussion that you have in your consenting reporting. And it also will mean that we will have the district plan fully updated as well. And that will include the decisions that have been made to date, as well as all the updated zoning and the like as well. So our intent is to have everything up to date in terms of the e-plan for what's been decided and published next week. Like I said, the Plan Change 13 hearing is next week, and that'll proceed on its standard course, and we'll report back to you in time when that concludes. The 1st of July is when we have penciled in a session regarding the opt-out options for Plan Change 14. And that is on the basis that the Select Committee is considering the changes to the Act that introduces the opt-out is set to report back on the 17th, I believe, so next week. And at that point, we'll have a clearer understanding for what changes may come about in terms of changes to the Act. And so, like I said, we intend to come to you on the 1st of July with where the Environment Select Committee have landed and what options appear to be available for changes to the Act, and get your views on those. And yeah, like I've said, the current law continues that we make a decision on the balance of Plan Change 14 by 12th of December. And that includes whether or not we opt out or not. Decision is required on that basis. Okay. That brings me to the end of the presentation.
Thank you. So I've got 4 questions and we've got about 8 minutes. So we'll start off with Mark.
Thank you. Riccarton Bush has its own act of parliament. Could that possibly be an avenue which the Bush Trust could exploring for amendment to protect the bush in face of the bush interface qualifying matter being written?
Sorry, say that again.
The Riccarton Bush has its own act of parliament, and could the Bush Trust look to seek a amendment to that act of parliament to you look at protecting the bush through that mechanism?
Well, broadly speaking, all legislation can change. The question would be, whether the change gets through. I haven't looked at that act for some time. I don't know if it's got any provisions in it about development outside of the Riccarton Bush. I kind of suspect it's at this stage confined to the bush itself.
I think that's where the 10 metre setback came back, for instance.
Right.
So whether there could then become a protection for the height.
But it is protected, it's got the fence.
Okay. Victoria?
Thanks. Question, Papanui Warmamoils. Did I understand you correctly that notwithstanding the Minister rejecting our alternative recommendation, we could still achieve the same level of protection in PC13?
More or less. There's a subtle difference between where PC13 is headed and its proposals versus the alternative recommendation. So, as far as I understand from Plan Change 13, the item, being the streets, is the streets to the public domain. And so any consenting is related to the specific parcel that exists. And so the adjoining private parcels is really the difference. So under Plan Change 13, it's just the public domain. And so if there's a resource consent within the street, absolutely, but most residential development, of course, will be in the private domain, and so there wouldn't be any consideration on that. The interface of that isn't considered alike as well. But the main difference with the alternative recommendation was that within the residential provisions, so the private aspects, it was a matter of consideration. It wasn't a standard that was set or anything, it's just a matter of consideration. And so that's the subtlety that exists there.
Similar, but not as helpful. From a residential perspective. That's Second right. Question there is in relation to the deeming provision. I was interested in this. It's not uncommon for there to be a transitionary period during this legislative reform. So does the deeming provision negate the need for a transition period?
Remains to be seen, potentially. Like I said, the Minister and government alike seem to be, at all intents and purposes, want to translate into this new framework very quickly. The deeming principle would obviously do that. Potentially absolve the need for transitionary powers. So but because we don't have a bill yet, so we don't.
So the deeming provision is not the ordinary tool that they use, is it?
It's not unusual for when you've got the new piece of legislation that requires new plans to be done, and that the making of those new plans under the new legislation is going to take some time. You need something applying in the meantime.
So it creates
so it's either
certainty?
Certainty.
Yeah.
Yeah. For the benefit of certainty. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to add, what may come in the bills remains to be seen is any requirements that are currently in the RMA for 10-yearly review of our district plan, compliance with national planning standards, whether those requirements are extinguished when the bill's introduced remains to be seen.
Thanks.
But, we wait with patience.
I'm technical. Thank you very much.
Aaron, as quick as you can.
Oh, yeah, my question was just around the mayor's response on the weekend. I think, was he misquoted in the media when he said about a kick in the guts? Because look at some of the negative points you raised. Was he meant to say a kick in the nuts?
You don't have to answer that. Sam?
Yeah, if we go back to Antonio Hall and Dearsbury, can you just talk us through what that would look like if they've deferred? So he's deferred the decisions. My view would be, let's get on and do something with them. Can you talk us through what that would look like and how we would go about that?
Just to be clear, you're asking whether or not we'd make a decision and just for those two sites in the next, few weeks, for example, rather than in the balance?
Yeah, particularly when you think about housing and things like that, where the intent has been to generate more housing, we should look at how we can get it moving.
So perhaps if we start with plan change 13, because that's the one that's coming first in time. So we've got the plan change 13 hearing next week. And in plan change 13, as I said, the plan change that was notified by the council didn't propose delisting of Antonio or Dearsbury. But submissions were put in proposing delisting of those two buildings. So those submitters are going to be heard at the hearing next week. Now, coming out of that might be a decision in PC 13 that those buildings get delisted.
Is that likely? Because my understanding was council staff, not you guys, but the heritage team, were not in favour of delisting.
Yeah, the evidence is a little bit mixed. And we're going to be having a chat this afternoon, aren't we, Mark, about what the council position is in the hearing of PC 13.
Yeah, because it surprised me, I guess, when we have taken this view and we've got an internal view which is different.
So I guess that comes down to the role of a planner or an expert presenting at a hearing is given their expert opinion to the hearings panel. But what Brent's alluding to this afternoon, we're talking about the legal submissions that are presented to that hearings panel. What is the position that's going to be expressed in those as opposed to the expert's opinion?
Can't just say councillors want this with the evidence base. Tyler?
Oh, sorry, can I just...
Sorry, hang on, Tyler.
In answering the
No worries.
thing. In terms of that last point that you raised, process, fundamentally, it's simply about receiving a decision report to council for those specific sites. You might recall that we did something similar for Central City Zone for the Policy 3 decision in December. I think it was September last year. It's the same concept effectively that we would come to you with zoning decision for those two sites. Like we said, the staff position is that it's better to be done in an integrated way to avoid the islandisation or isolation of different pockets of zoning, so it's done comprehensively, and also to see where plan change 13 ends up, because the hearing's next week. So that's the staff position. Of course, council can request to have a decision before it.
Yeah, it would be good to look at that, just given, the minister's view's been, how do we get on and have housing? And they've done it in other places, and we sort of look at those and go, well, actually, if there's a way forward on them, then we should do it. But it would be good, maybe once we've got that organisational view on what, how we're presenting it, whether we can use that as the platform to progress that. But I would be keen to see what that looks like. And I'm not speaking for Tyler, but Tyler, I suspect you share the same view.
So Tyler,
yeah.
question?
I do share the same view. Thanks, Sam. I am hoping to hurry up Antonio Hall. It's been quite a significant one, and I'm just worried about the risks of expert opinion within that PC 13 hearing, which may be contradictory to council's view. What does that look like? And if, say for example, Antonio Hall goes to the PC 13 hearings panel, and the hearings panel deem that it's not necessary to delist Antonio Hall and Dearsbury, what position does that put the council in?
Well, it's not really it's not a risk or a problem in terms of the council position. It is an outcome that's not the outcome that the council wants. But in terms of the way it plays out in Plan Change 13, it's simply a matter that needs to be dealt with. And it's that, as Mark said a moment ago, the council's got no control over what neutral, independent experts give in their evidence. They're performing their professional role wholly appropriately.
And I'd hope so too. Yeah, they do a fantastic job.
In most cases, when the council takes a plan change to a hearing, the position of council is the same as its expert witnesses. But we're going to be having a chat about whether that's actually feasible in this case, because we know that the council decision on PC 14 was that it seeks delisting of those two buildings. So that is the council position as we understand it.
Okay.
Right.
I have some questions which will probably be better offline, but I just wanted to raise that in public. I'll have questions around the Pico Shands Crescent character provisions, and also Dean's Ave, the mixed use side of that being put against. I'm wondering if there are any alternative avenues for us to be able to try and reassess, particularly Dean's Ave, by reinstating it to be mixed use, or instating it to be mixed use, or is it just done and dusted? This is just going to be residential on that Dean's Ave site.
Yeah, in terms of that last question, Councillor, the Minister's decision is final, so any deviation or evolution or otherwise of that, another plan change would be required to do so.
That's gutting. Yeah, thanks, mate. Appreciate it.
So, Andre, final question to you. Yanni, we're out. Hang on, see what we can do.
What we've ended up with is allowing, building up to 10 stories out as far as Hornby, but you won't be able to build up to 3 stories within, a short amount of the central city. I'm keen to understand how we're able to revisit a decision like SOMO, which was a decision made with a lot of confusion about how it would be applied and works and so on and so forth. But what's a way forward to be able to revisit something like that? So I think all of us agree we want to focus intensification around the central city rather than out in the suburbs.
Yeah, so it's similar to the situation for Deans Avenue.
Yeah.
The Minister's decision is final. Council has made its Policy 3 decision, which was the influence of SOMO. That was its opportunity and it didn't do so. So the only opportunity to make that change to, for example, the mixed use zone would be another plan change.
That's right, a couple of years.
We'll conscious there'll be other scenarios and we'll come back with further advice around next steps.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Sure,
is everyone okay if we take one more question from Yanni? We're a bit over time.
No.
He's had a lot in his career.
Go Yanni, quick.
A lot of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think just one of the big issues is capacity, right? So the whole purpose of this is to provide more zoning capacity. Do you have a quantum of zoning capacity difference between what we did as a council and what the Minister's decision has been? What's the net difference in zoning capacity?
I don't think we're at that stage yet, to be honest, because we haven't made the full decision on plan change 14, to provide a short answer. But at the end of the day, the zoning extent is very, very small. It's quite niche around, in the great scheme of things, around Linwood, Hornby and for Bickett and Bush. Those are the only areas where the zoning differences between where the IHP was and the council position.
And the catchments around Barrington, Hallswell, Wigram, so changing from...
There's no change there.
No, there was a change from, we had 400 metre catchment and the panel went to 200 metre.
You're talking about the council staff position before the recommendation as opposed to the council alternative recommendation.
What was our council alternative recommendation?
Just give us a map.
It was the same as the IHP in terms of the catchment. There was no change whatsoever. We didn't. The alternative was simply about saying that the precinct should exist to be providing more enabling petition planes for multi-unit development. It didn't change the catchments whatsoever. Just adopted the IHP's recommendation.
So anyway, can anticipate that question coming in the future when we've got more clarity about the
and the only other thing is
zoning.
And I know not now, but it would be good to get some visual illustrations of, looking on like for Linwood and maybe Hornby, but just actually showing people what the heights now are compared to what's currently existing.
Yeah, we have done some of the evidence, so we can circulate that.
Hey, thank you so much. And we'll go forward and wait with anticipation on the result of the hearing next week. Start.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.